All right, so good evening, everybody. It's a delight to be introducing the first talk or first workshop of our FAAH online workshop series for spring 2021. This series is an opportunity for the Department of Fine Arts and Art History to bring together different members of this particular department and other scholars in the field or in the university to bring us together and kind of have a conversation that circles around, key points of interest and intersections in research and sort of works in progress. So it's supposed to be more conversational and more of a discussion between the participants. And today we have Dr. Joseph Hammond, who is an assistant professor in art history, focusing on the Renaissance period, and he teaches in the faculty in the Department of Fine Arts and Art History. And in conversation with him, we have Dr. Kathryn Maude, who is an assistant professor in the English program. And so they will be taking the lead here. And the idea is that they'll talk for about an hour with each other, and then around 7:30 Beirut time, we'll open it up to questions from attendees. My name is Halauji. I also teach in the Fine Arts and Art History department. So I'll hand it over to you, Joseph. And can I ask everyone who besides Joseph and Kathryn to please mute yourselves and turn off your cameras.
Okay. Thanks very much, Hala, and thanks very much to everybody for coming, and to Kath for joining me today. Today we're hoping, as I say, that this is going to be fairly conversational, and I'm quite happy to be interrupted and to change the topic of conversation. I'm not really planning on having like a straight argument. I'm not going to make a kind of this isn't going to be a speech or formal presentation of conclusions or anything. So like it's quite discursive. So please interrupt me and at any point and put questions in the chat box if you like. But otherwise, I think I'll begin by outlining a little about some of the standard ideas of death that operated in the late medieval period and in the Renaissance, partly because I think there's probably a lot of people on this call who of varying levels of expertise, and I think it's probably a good idea if we start with a baseline of understanding, but also because I think we often take some of these things for granted, that we think we understand how they work, and in fact there's a lot of kind of complexities and difference here and across the year. So I'm going to begin at the beginning, if you'll excuse the expression. So in the early Christian period, in the very early Christian period, in the first couple of centuries, they fully anticipated, according to the book of Revelation, of course, that Christ was going to come again to judge the living and the dead, and that this would be imminent. It said so, and so they believed it. And so I've included a PowerPoint presentation. I'm not going to talk about every picture, but I like pictures, so here they are. And so just to outline the quick schema, we all are familiar with the idea that in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve sinned, they were punished. One of those punishments was that they would die, they would return to the dust from which they were made. That Christ came in the New Testament, he took on that death upon himself to repay that debt, and was resurrected, to, quote unquote, defeating death, to prove that there would be life eternal. And in the future, he would come again to judge the living and the dead, as we see in this. And I've kind of chosen these partly because this is the beginning of the Renaissance, the middle of the Renaissance, and the end of the Renaissance, if you like. But I mean, there's lots of, these are very common images, right? So here he is in the middle, saving those who are bodily resurrected and reunited with their souls, and damning others to hell. So in the early medieval period, or rather in antiquity, there was an assumption that this was going to happen imminently, and there wasn't a lot of concern about how this was going to work out. Instead, there was an assumption that when people died, you just slept until the second coming. And so this, and being a Christian was usually considered sufficient, right? There was no like concern about how Christian or how virtuous you had to be, because there were, you know, from a Christian point of view, other concerns about converting pagans and what have you. As the medieval period wears on, and it becomes increasingly, or it seems to them that there's a general sense that Christianity is the only game in town now. Now it becomes an issue about who amongst Christians gets to go into the kingdom of heaven. And so somewhere around I don't know, maybe other people can correct me here, I'm not a medievalist, but somewhere around the 11th century, there's a development of this idea of last judgment, and this starts entering in much more forcefully into the I see Kath is nodding in agreement, so that's very reassuring, thank you. The last judgment starts coming in to feature, and people start becoming increasingly worried about whether or not they're going to heaven or going to hell. And as these discussions go on, we end up with individual issues. It no longer seems reasonable that people have to wait and are just asleep until the final judgment. Instead, there is the development of, as well as this universal judgment that happens to everyone, there is a period of particular judgment that happens to everyone upon death. So upon death, you are judged according to the virtues and vices of your life. And here is an early Renaissance scale where the angel is trying to defend his soul against a demon who's being literally weighed up for their virtues and vices. And this is another example from an apocalypse imagery of these souls have their book of life, right, with all their sins and good deeds written out, like an account book. And this is very kind of judicial and has these kind of accountancy type ideas that's bound up with it. And so you then had three options, right? You could be damned immediately to hell, you could be sent to purgatory, which is essentially, I think, an 11th, 12th and 13th century development, and or you could go straight to heaven. Purgatory, of course, you would go there and you would be purged of your crimes. In some sense, it's a step towards heaven, but in another sense, so it's closer to heaven, but in another sense, it's also a place where you would be punished for your crimes and purged of those sins, and that would be torturous, and the tortures were alike to those in hell. And so, although it's a step to heaven, it's also very similar to hell and much to be feared. So after death, if you were lucky, you got to go to heaven, and heaven was conceived in terms, by 1336, this becomes a kind of defined doctrine of the church. Denying it becomes heresy, as had recently happened, which is why they passed the legislation. But according to this line in Corinthians, at the moment, we understand God and we understand the world as if in a muddied or cloudy, or in the famous phrase, what's the phrase go? A darkling mirror or something?
In a glass darkly.
In a glass darkly, thank you. Yeah, in this kind of nicely poetic phrase of, I think that's the King James version. Through a glass darkly, yeah, exactly. Thank you. But in the afterlife, in heaven, we will then get to see clearly the truth. We will get to see face to face, and we will be known as we are known through sight. The assumption was that through the bodily resurrection, that experience would be at least partly physical of heaven. It would no longer be separate. Soul and body would be reunited in heaven, and your experience of the divine, of that of God, of heavenly bliss, would be this beatific vision, or visio beatifica. And the way to get there was, of course, through a good death. So the good death in the late medieval period and in the Renaissance was matched by there was an iconography of it, and it was available mainly to martyrs and saints. You had to be rarely and spectacularly good. You know, this wasn't really available to the vast majority of us. And so here's St. Francis dying, his St. Clare. I rather like the spidery fingers in this one. Yeah, it's great. And it's marked by a particular iconography, right? It's usually you have enough time to prepare for your death. It's not diseased. Disease was often seen as a punishment for sin. And so people who die kind of naturally and just sort of peacefully, or kind of like they just get tired one day and pop off in their sleep, as it were. This is seen as a good death. A violent or disease-ridden death, or a death in which you go out kind of reluctantly or suddenly or angrily, is seen as a bad death. And you still kind of see this in the movies. Like I think Star Wars has a particular thing with this, right? So Obi-Wan Kenobi willingly dies. He sacrifices himself for his friends. And he kind of experiences this moment of peace just before he goes, whereas Emperor Palpatine dies screaming, plunging into a pit, and very reluctantly, right? But the good Christian not only knows that he's going to die, but knows that there's nothing to fear from death because he's good, and he knows it. And so there's loads of these images, right? Is St. Martin on the left, and they're often based around this ideal of the apocryphal stories of the death of the Virgin Mary. And so there's this long-running tradition that goes right back to the early church, which suggests that even though that there's nothing to fear from death, right? A good Christian, this gives you access to eternal life, to bliss, to heaven. This is the reward for everything that you've done on earth, for a good Christian life. I think, I forget who it was, Ambrose or something, said something like, you know, a good Christian, I think it's Ambrose anyway, a good Christian doesn't need to fear death, doesn't need to fear the reaper. However, there is, of course, death itself is, of course, a troubling, frightening period for most people. And so, and the Bible and the theological tradition makes it very clear that there are some terrifying aspects of this. And most of us, since we're not saints, at least speaking for myself, and are unlikely to die like a saint, right? So Genesis makes it very clear that, so I've included the quotes here for anyone who's interested, and if anyone wants to, I'm happy to send them this PowerPoint, so you can see the. Anyway, Genesis makes it very clear that death is a punishment for sin. So death and sin are closely related. The Romans, the Pauline epistle to the Romans writes very clearly that the wages of sin is death. And Revelation, okay, you should, if you do want a copy, email me afterwards, because and I'll send it along. Okay. And Revelation's, I think for the first time, I'm not sure, maybe there are other parts of the Bible, when it's describing the apocalypse, the end of time, second coming of Christ, it uses this famous phrase. So I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed after. And so the idea that death as a figure, as a person, as a personification, was always followed by damnation, by hell, is clearly stated in the Bible. And so this figure of a kind of skeletal death as a punishment and as a forerunner to damnation is also very prevalent in the literature, in artworks. And so we see there's a lot of these in Italy. They're mostly, this kind of macabre imagery is mostly associated with Northern Europe, but there's actually quite a lot of it in Italy. This is a very famous example. unfortunately, it met its own aerial death, as it were, because it was destroyed by Allied bombs during the Second World War. But so we have a black and white picture, but you can see this is the death who's laying low the population, and all these demons are running off with little baby-like souls and stuffing them into fiery fissures in the mountains. And some angels are trying to save a few in a kind of battle for the souls that's kind of similar to this angel we saw at the beginning. There's some crossovers. And so yeah, I guess so what prompted my my discussion and interest in this topic, aside from the work of Pep, was these pictures that I'm going to show you here, where death isn't terrifying, where death seems to be one of the good guys, helping this soul in their journey, in their introduction to the Virgin Mary. Or in this example, death is introducing a young knight to his lady love at a medieval tournament. Yeah, and so maybe I'll end there unless someone has. That's my spiel about death in this period. This is where we've got to, right? So, yeah.
Great. Thank you. I think that really helped to set the scene for some of the questions that I wanted to ask you. So I feel like you set it up very well. And because we're on this slide, I think I'll start with the element of class. I was kind of interested for us to talk about how death works for different sections of the population in this period, right? So we see this suggestion here, I think, that the nobility would somehow meet a different death, right? And I'm thinking of death with a capital D here, right? We don't have the death on the pale horse that is kind of scourging those in front of him. We have death here as a kind of friendly, helping figure, in both of these cases, standing just behind the figure, kind of ushering them in to something that looks quite pleasant. In this case, the relationship with this woman, but in the other image, if you just go back to it, kind of pointing towards the moment of seeing clearly, I suppose, that we were talking about before, the moment of seeing heaven. So rather than the kind of reaper of souls, he becomes some kind of, almost like a kind of fellow knight figure. He becomes a kind of fellow noble figure, a kind of soft death, right? Maybe we can see it as a kind of domestication of death. So I wanted to ask you, you talk about it in Joseph's forthcoming article, he talks about it as classical, individual and comforting, which I think is a really wonderful phrase. So I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about the kind of class composition of death. Why is it, do you think, that nobility get this kind of soft death? And also I thought, I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit about the private and public aspects of this, because some of the big images that you show, right, were kind of frescoes. They were public images that would have been seen by a lot of people. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, like this one, exactly. This is something that you always experience in the company of others, right? Whereas the shield, I suppose there's a kind of display element of that. And then the patron portrait, I suppose that's a more individual or perhaps private element. So I wondered if you could just talk a little bit, both about the kind of class composition of how death works, but also about the kind of public-private distinction in these images. Where are they looking? Where do you see them? Does it change the imagery of death, depending on whether you see them in the company of other people? And I'm thinking about this as the kind of, so late medieval England is my kind of more immediate area of expertise, right? So I'm thinking about this as we have a lot of these visual images on the walls of churches, right? Kind of imagery on the walls of churches that as you were preaching, right, the moments of the sermon could be pointed out, right? So you know, you're talking the wages of sin are death, you know, and then you point to the image of the Last Judgment on the wall. There's a kind of public dramatic element of it. So yeah, I was just kind of interested in how the kind of class composition of this works, and also how that kind of distinction between a kind of private devotional object and a kind of public facing fresco might work in these images, as far as you think.
Sure, yeah. So this picture was, yeah, as you say, in a public place. It was on the walls of the cloister at the cathedral, and on the processional route out of the church for funerals, where so the public would have had regular access to this. They would have walked past it on a daily basis. There was likely to have been funerals, or at least certainly weekly anyway. And it was almost certainly patronized and paid for by, I mean, I should probably double check this, but either by a confraternity directly associated with the cathedral, or by the cathedral authorities themselves. And so it's been described by other scholars as a kind of, like, as you kind of outlining as a kind of visual sermon, not in the sense that it's a direct relationship to any one particular sermon, but in the idea that it presents a series of ideas which sermonizers or priests or whatever you can respond to or can use, and that it does include a series of messages about good and bad behavior. So although it's hard to make out, I'm sorry because it's been destroyed, but there's some examples of kind of good behaviors up here, where we've got these monks in the wilderness, and these guys singing and playing music. I think that it's a little bit ambiguous, but I prefer the case that they also are a good behavior. They're a secular good behavior in opposition to the religious good behavior. And then everybody else in the middle, all this great gang of other people who are being slaughtered in large numbers, they're the average people who are coming to a rotten end. And a lot of these scenes were accompanied by injunctions to behave yourself or else. And so I think it's described by Chiara Fugoni as a kind of visual sermon in which the viewer is left in little doubt that they should strive to be virtuous or expect to be damned, which is pretty harsh, right? She puts it in these terms, and but I think there's an element of truth here, right? It's a very preachy thing to do in a very, but in the kind of almost worst sense of that word, preachy, right? And in a ritually relevant context, yeah, exactly. So it becomes ritualized in the sense that it becomes part of the daily life and practice of the people who live and operate in this sphere. These other objects, however, are a little bit different, right? So we can come back to this one because it was almost certainly an altarpiece, but I look at this one as this is a parade shield. It's clearly intended for some kind of public display, but public display within an ambit that is almost exclusively for aristocrats. There might have been a few other staff around, and probably were, but mostly the audience, the intended audience, is aristocratic. And similarly, I think these kind of images are often, this is a manuscript of Dante's Divine Comedy. It's very beautifully illustrated. It cost, I mean, I dread to think, but it was a very, very expensive luxury item, well outside, would have easily cost a year's wages for your average artisan, if not much more. And I look at a series of these kind of images as well, which I can talk about in a sec, where there's a figure of death that is part of the sequence. And these two are all part of luxury items that almost exclusively would have been would have been available only to an elite. And I think there's an inevitability about this, right? The elites can and do pay for things. They have the money and the political power. And so there's an inevitability about them presenting certain stories from their point of view, if that makes sense. And what they want to see is not just stuff that inevitably presented from their worldview, but that presents them, that is comforting to some degree, right? So they want or need or feel a desire, like we all do, to believe that they are good and virtuous and can get to heaven through images like this. And meanwhile, they also want to frighten and terrify the poor into behaving themselves. These are controlling images, as they're sometimes called, right? They're didactic and so they come with an assumption that the poor are they're the problem, they're the danger, they're the disruptive sinners. If plague strikes our city, that's not because the rich have been poorly behaved, that's because the poor are sinners. It is the assumption of an image like this, especially because of this group of literate, music-making, poetry-singing aristocrats on the right here. But I think, and I think this too joins in with this persistent idea that one day there will also be a collective judgment, right? So there's some, I think, general sense that aristocracy at this time, the nobility, believed that they were okay and that they were going to get to heaven, that they had led a good life, and they would be, so death would free them into the life eternal. But there's also awareness that at the end of time, their ability to stay in heaven could be scuppered if the population at large lets the team down, and then they too could be damned in a kind of collective damnation, which was also a kind of
kind of also a concern. I don't know if I can simultaneously share my screen. I'm going to try, but I think this is really interesting to me, because in the English context with which I'm more familiar, there is at least perhaps not the only set of imagery about death, but there is a set of imagery about death which threatens that kind of noble, I don't know what we want to call it, kind of calm about the possibility of a good death, or the possibility that they'll be kind of ushered gently into heaven. So for example, we have this image. I don't know if you can see it.
Yep.
Of the three living and the three dead, which this is a 14th century image. And it's actually interesting to me, partly because it's there's a lot of things I like about this image. One of the ones is the fact that the three dead look like a penalty shootout lineup, because they're all covering their genitals in a line. But the more that I think is interesting about it is that we see here, right, three representations of earthly power. A pope on the far left with the mitre, an emperor in the middle, and a king on the right, all holding the elements of their office, right? So the pope has got his mitre, the emperor in the middle is holding a big sword, demonstrating his kind of earthly power and earthly might, and then we've got the king holding the sceptre and the Auburn sceptre, again, and with his lovely crown, and all picked out in gold, right? Demonstrating the kind of high status elements of this manuscript. This is a 15th century manuscript. And it's at the beginning of the Office of the Dead. So it's at the beginning of the liturgy for the funeral service. And what we see here on the right-hand side are the kind of three characters that they meet, right? They meet themselves in the future. And the three dead say to the three living in the kind of versions of this tale, you know, beware, because you'll turn out like me, right? You won't look like this in the future. So there's a kind of lovely Old English section where they say, the three living cry out, I am afraid, ich am afeard. Lo what I see, lo what it say, and methinks there be devils three, methinkes hit be deviles three. And then the three dead reply, ich was well fair, I was well fair, such shall you be, and for God's love beware by me, right? For God is love, beware by me. So this is a kind of threat of the future. Yeah, and so I was kind of interested, kind of thinking about the way that nobility in the schemes that you've shown us kind of escape this threat of death, right? Because this is a threat that if you don't behave properly, if you don't do the things that you should, if you're not, in this case, a good pope, a good emperor, a good king, and good in the Christian context, that you will become this kind of set of broken bodies, right? That you'll become, that death comes to us all, right? As the kind of trite saying goes. So I was kind of interested in whether there are any of these kind of memento mori, of remembrances of death in the imagery that you know from this period. And if not, why do you think that there isn't? That might be too big a question to answer, but.
Okay, maybe I'll go quick share my screen because a little bit on that.
Yeah.
So there absolutely are. Actually, this image includes exactly this: the three living and the three dead. These three horsemen here. Can you see my cursor? Yeah. These three horsemen here are meeting their three corpses in their graves here. And the three living and the three dead do appear in Italian contexts. There's a famous there's a bunch of these images at Assisi. This image is very often cut out suggestively. So when people talk about the Renaissance, they want to talk about perspective. So they crop the image and only include the top half, and then they just cut out the corpse at the bottom because the corpse is medieval and isn't Renaissance enough. So they edit that bit out. I don't. This isn't. I brought one along as well, right? This is quite a famous one. You're probably familiar with this one, right? But anyway, yeah, these images exist in. Where have I gone? In the Italian context as well. And I think these public images in particular, I think there is an element where I think we can say that the horrors of earthly existence, which I'm sorry to say we're worryingly familiar with, the horrors of earthly existence are going to be adjusted. They're going to be repaired in the next life. You know, Christ comes on the Mount of Olives and says, the meek shall be rewarded and charity will prevail in the kingdom of heaven, right? And he says things like, it is easier for a rich man to get into the kingdom of, to get through the eye of a needle than to get into the kingdom of heaven. And so there's a lot of kind of, there's some very ambiguous elements to attitudes about the rich and poor in Christianity. And I think images like this and a lot of that rhetoric helped to assuage the anger, arguably, of the poor or sense of injustice. That images like this told the public that divine justice was coming and the inequalities and injustices of this world were going to be repaired in the next, that they hadn't been abandoned by their God. They just had to be patient. And so there are scenes. There's a small group of beggars here who are so desperately poor and so miserable that they are pleading, their arms outstretched, asking for death to come early for them. So there's an element of that, right? Which I think is important. I think where you see this appear in manuscripts is also pretty interesting because I brought along an example. This is from Italy, and it's great. I love this picture. Pep showed me this actually, so you might know a bit more about it than I do. But but I think there's a difference between, we're being chatted to, who said that? It's the opposite today, yeah, yes. Parrot. Oh, yes, parrot, yes, and the D, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between that, and I think the way these books work, the way the books in particular work as devotional objects, is as soon as you own the book, as soon as you are spending time examining yourself and your sins and contemplating your own death, you're doing the active work of preparing yourself for death, the good Christian charitable, pious work, the self-reflexive prayer, etc., that guarees you then the access to the afterlife that you want. And so there's a strange sense that these images really do domesticate death in manuscripts like this, right? They are really saying that by thinking about it more, you're taming it. The more you think about it, the more you contemplate it, the more you own things like this and puzzle upon them and do that self-examination and ask for your forgiveness, the more you're guaranteed to get the outcome that you want. This is about helping them get the good death. And of course, that good death, precisely because manuscripts like this were expensive, is disproportionately available to the rich. And so what we have is this system where both the vehicles for getting the good death and the vehicles for representing the good death are available only to the rich, because that's the nature of patronage, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting in relation to, and again, you can tell me whether this happens in the Italian context, but in the English context, especially in what we call the late Middle Ages and would be the Renaissance in the Italian context, we can maybe talk about that distinction a little bit in a second, is rings that kind of protect the wearer. So they tend to be images of St. Barbara or St. Christopher, both of whom were thought to facilitate a good death. So if you looked at an image of St. Christopher, there's actually a fresco in a church in the south of England that says above it in Old French, like, if you look upon St. Christopher today, then today you will not have a bad death. Right, and so with the ring, obviously you look upon St. Christopher every day, and St. Christopher was associated, he's the patron saint of travelers, which is how perhaps our audience might know him better, but he's also the patron saint of a good death because of a famous story in which St. Christopher as a giant carries the Christ child across the water, right? And you can see that in kind of echoes of Chiron carrying the souls across the river. In kind of classical mythology, right? And so because St. Christopher carries the Christ child across the river, he is the kind of saint that ushers you into a good death. So if you look upon the image of St. Christopher on your hands, or if you see him, and similarly with St. Barbara, that they will kind of usher you into this good death that you deserve. But as you say, most of the rings that we still have are gold, right? You would have had to have been of a certain class to kind of have that kind of disposable wealth to be able to have that kind of jewelry on you. I wanted to ask you a little bit, or maybe we can talk a little bit about the kind of, I guess I would call it the intimacy of death in this period, both in the sense that it happens a lot, right? We have a lot of people dying in childbirth in particular. In the early medieval period in England, that's the leading cause of death for women under 40, as far as they can tell by skeletons, is in childbirth. So we have a lot of death in childbirth, which is particularly interesting to me in relation to this decayed female noble figure, right? Because there are elements of being a noble woman that aren't entirely easy, and one of those is bringing forth an heir, right? So if you are pregnant, you have a sense, even though if you're nobility, because of the state of kind of maternal medicine, that you may bring forth a child like in pain and suffering, and it may be the end of you, right? So I think that there are kind of intimate dangers for noble women, but also the intimacy of death in the sense that you were expected to meditate upon it. There's an anchoritic guidance text from about 1215 called the Anchor Wissa. So an anchorite was a woman who normally a woman. There were some male anchorites too, but it's 75% female in the later medieval period, from the kind of statistics that we have. A woman who would be walled up in a cell attached to a church. And the office for the dead, the kind of funeral mass, would be said over the door, and the door would be walled up so that she wouldn't escape. But it was, I say that she wouldn't escape, but this was a free choice. This was a mode of religious piety, right? And it's a mode of religious piety that's really centrally about the regular imagination of your own death. And one of the lines in the Anchor the rule for anchorites, is look at your white hands and look at the dark earth of the floor of your cell, and dig in the dark earth of your cell with your white hands, right? So we have that kind of very striking image of the white hands in the dark earth, and dig your own grave in the floor of your cell. And anchorites were actually buried then in the floor of their cell. They never ever kind of came out. And so there is an element of a kind of constant presence of death in medieval religious life. And I'm a religious specialist, so I was kind of interested in this idea of death as a kind of constant presence and a kind of constant thing to be meditated upon, and as kind of an intimate thing, something that you would have a ring on you at all times to remind you of, or something that you would think about every day as you said your prayers. And I wondered whether something like the parade shield, or something like these kind of more public images, I wondered how they fitted into that, and what you thought about how that worked in this period, in the Italian context. You know, what was the kind of assumption about death? How often were you supposed to think about it, I guess?
I'm not sure. I think I am interested in that Christopher story. Like I read this thing about Christopher, but I guess I didn't put two and two together about that the river in the story is then paralleled with the river Styx. It's assumed almost to be the river Styx. That's interesting. I wonder how early that assumption was made. Anyway. I don't know, it's hard to say, right? I mean, I think like, it seems to me, I'm going to borrow from what Pippa's told me. So, I mean, she's on the call. She can pipe up and interrupt me if she likes. But like the Office of the Dead was performed every day, right, in churches. That it appeared in books of hours, which members, especially after printing, especially after they were printed, became much more widely available, and people were expected to read them in private devotion to themselves outside of church. And death would have been, certainly funerals would have been extremely public and virtually ongoing. There was practically, especially in any major city, there would have been a practically endless stream of funerals happening. And that would have been much more common. But also there was the tradition of vigils over corpses, right? That disappeared. I'm not sure exactly when, but well after the Renaissance, where it was quite common for, I mean, it was the norm where someone would die, and if they were in any way respectable, had any money or family to support them or what have you, they would be laid out, and anyone passing by could come in and pay their respects, even if they had never met this person before. And that was a normal thing to do, in a way that now to us might seem a little unusual, that you might attend to the body of someone you had never met and feel welcome in to walk into a home that you'd never been into before, just because a corpse was laid out there. And of course, like I think it structured a lot of people's thinking. The tradition in Italian scholarship has been to assume that it's virtually absent, right? There's a general assumption that death is associated with the medieval period and it's not associated with the Renaissance. And so this is really kind of a 19th century idea. But I mean, you know, it's and that continues to be a factor right up into the 50s and early 60s. Altarpiece, I know I'm repeating myself somewhat, but Altarpiece, in his painting in Florence and Siena after the Black Death, writes that because of the Black Death in 1348, the Renaissance that was begun by Giotto is essentially stalled. Italy becomes, or Tuscany becomes macabre and anxious, and its art returns to a kind of hierarchical, diagrammatic, and medieval style. And this isn't really true for a number of different reasons. But I think he's clearly making this distinction between the Renaissance and the medieval period. And so there's a lack of scholarship, frankly, about this. There's an enormous quantity of scholarship on the material production of an economy of death, which might have been the largest single industry in Italy that is more or less undiscussed in those terms. Every tomb, every altarpiece, every chapel, almost every church, of which, you know, if you go to a medieval town in Italy, there's a church every 100 or so yards. You know, all of these, the masses that were said, the ceremonies that were paid for, that people put up money so that masses, hundreds of masses in some cases, would be said for years and decades and centuries in some cases. And in some cases, the books, you can go to the archives and you can see the books of all these masses that are laid out in kind of tables, and people have paid for them, and, you know, for so long that they're still being said during the in the 18th century, when Napoleon takes over and it all comes to a crashing end, right? This anti-clericism just blows it all out of the water. And so they never finished. They never finished singing all these masses for the dead. Which is just kind of amazing. But they're all paid for, right? And they're all going every day, all the time. And so all of this is kind of studied by Renaissance scholars and by people studying Italian art, but it's usually not studied in terms of them trying to understand and cope with and accommodate and build death into their lives in a way that is done in the North, frankly, or done in the medieval period. And so there isn't a lot of good literature on that topic, I'm afraid. I think, which is one of the reasons why I think my article, though I say it myself, is worthwhile. It's a step forward in that direction.
I mean, in general, this is a very interesting question, right? These questions about death and how people coped with it and what people did, I think will feel especially fresh. I think when I was reading your article, felt especially fresh to me in the wake of a current pandemic, right? That a lot of the wrestling with death that's done in this period is wrestling with death on a mass scale. So thinking about the plague in England, right, in the 1300s, or thinking about the epidemics that you talk about in these Italian cities, right, that post Giotto, you know, there's this kind of these epidemics, that you can't just reckon with death individually anymore. And I think that one of the things that I've been thinking about and that your article made me think about is how we can start reckoning with death on a collective scale rather than on an individual scale. I think one of the things that I've seen is people trying to, you know, the front page of the New York Times trying to kind of data visualize the number of deaths, the sheer number of deaths in America, right? The 500,000 deaths. They tried, you know, they did a front page that was kind of lots of little dots. And I saw it and I thought, you know, the thing about this is this it's supposed to humanize, but in fact it dehumanizes, right? It turns these people into dots, right? The tools of data visualization are not working for us to think about death collectively. And so, and I know this is a big question and I'm not expecting you to have an answer to it, but it was very much present in my mind as I was reading your work. There are collective ways of managing mass death in the period. And I wondered if there was anything that you felt like you'd kind of got from that, or that you felt like had kind of stuck with you about those collective ways of managing death, both in the sense of this kind of production of artwork, but also I know in your article you talk more as well about the kind of production of literature and the way that literature kind of manages this work. So I know that's a big question, but it's something I think that it's really important for us to address. Is, you know, individual grief is not sufficient somehow. And I think that the late medieval period and the Renaissance had a sense of death as something collective. Sorry, I feel like I've put you on the spot there a little bit. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think my impression anyway is that there are two big differences. One, that the death, in a profound and important sense, was not the end, and that there was a community of the dead, just as there is a community of the living, and a community of people, and the community of the dead were not inaccessible. You know, you could pray for them and they could intercede for you. They were not gone in important ways, and people kept them alive on purpose and actively. There was a conscious work being done to remember, and that's all facilitated by, of course, the religious belief structures or belief system that we shared, right? Which makes it easier, right? You know, in a secular age without shared religious beliefs, where, you know, as Philip Aries in his book, The Hour of Our Death, outlines, you know, death has become medicalized and hidden, distant. The dead are gone, and there's no, like, it's a totally different kind of space. I don't know that we think of as death as being the same thing, of course, because people still die, but the experience of it is so radically different. I'm not sure it's helpful. I'm afraid.
No, it's not that I was expecting help in some ways, but I think the sense of the collective is interesting to me. Before I let anyone else ask a question, I wanted to kind of finish this kind of section of our discussion by asking you about this kind of late medieval Renaissance distinction. So in Italy, the Renaissance begins much earlier than the Renaissance begins in kind of English scholarship. So in English scholarship, we start the Renaissance between 1500 and 1550, whereas in Italy, you've often got kind of 200 years on that, right? 200 years earlier-ish time periods. So I wanted to ask you about the kind of politics of these claims to rebirth, right? So in Italy, the rebirth begins 200 years earlier, whereas in England, we have to wait for our rebirth for another 200 years. And I wanted you to just kind of talk a little bit or think a little bit aloud about the kind of political, what's at stake in this idea of the Renaissance. What does it do? And perhaps what does it do in relation to these ideas about death that you have kind of outlined?
I'm not sure. I think there is a wider claim about the Renaissance that's generally being made in regards to death in the Renaissance. I might have to think about that, but the wider claim about the Renaissance is that this is a period in Renaissance Italy that invents individuality, that invents secularity, that invents, to some degree, democracy and capitalism. A lot of those things are also pinned to the 18th century. But a lot of people like to draw these lines back, right? They look at double entry bookkeeping, they look at the emergence of increasingly globalized trades, they look at the Renaissance, and they see what they believe to be a secular and individualist age, which I don't think is necessarily true. And they hope to pin the origins of modernity there. And they do that because they want to see those things as underpinning the modern state. But I don't think they underpin the modern state either. And what they do is they, especially when they're tied up with ideas about high art, they justify a sense of cultural superiority and inevitable historical progress that I think is also not necessarily true and a little bit dangerous and self-justifying in the kind of entitlements that we see in Western historiography and a Western sense of cultural superiority, if that makes sense.
Yeah, this kind of unstoppable movement towards secular capitalist democracy as a kind of, in literature scholarship of England, people have started to call it the early modern period, right? Making a claim for modernity in this kind of the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries as the period that kind of births the modern. Yeah, so I think that kind of, I think your discussion of death as something that Renaissance art historians in particular have attributed as a kind of backwards medieval practice, the focus on death, kind of fits into some of those narratives, right? That is a kind of backwards looking element instead of a kind of forwards looking focus on the individual life and individual accomplishments. And we've talked about this in the past, but this kind of great man version of history where you have this great man and he's doing his great deeds. I feel like we could talk for a long time, but I want to make sure that we have some kind of time for questions and responses and discussions. So I noticed that in the chat, somebody's asked us, is that communal attitude towards death related to the practice of homes being open for public viewings of the corpse? And when and where was this practiced? I don't think it was practiced as much in England, but I might be wrong about that. Joseph, do you know about when it was practiced in Italy?
My understanding is that it was common throughout the Renaissance period, at least in principle, that it was a medieval practice, like it would have been around for a while, that it started before the Renaissance and carried on through it. But at least in principle, that's what was available, right? That's what should happen. But of course, this too was class related, right? I mean, you couldn't, if you were incredibly poor, you couldn't walk into an aristocrat's house and expect not to get thrown out by the doorkeeper. And so, in fact, these end up being kind of social. These are, I mean, again, I'm sort of borrowing from Sarah's research here, but there's an inevitable bind both of the community in these events, but also of hierarchy across that community.
I wanted to ask a question, but I wasn't able to raise my hand. I think maybe because I'm the host. And you guys might have already covered this. Thank you both so much for this very enlightening conversation. I really don't know much about the subject, and I was wondering, and again, forgive me if you've already discussed this, Joseph and Kathryn, but with all these images, and as Kathryn asked early on, this notion of scale and the location of certain some of these images. I was wondering, was this iconography visually legible? I mean, what is the aspect of visual literacy here amongst those who would have seen some of these larger scale murals or paintings? And like specifically the image that you showed, Joseph, of the allegory of sin and redemption. I was wondering how, whether people were actually understood what they were seeing here, I mean, and I was wondering if you have a sense of who these audiences were, you know, and whether these sorts of images sort of were perennial motifs that they have been seeing in different places, and maybe there is a sense of illiteracy when it comes to this iconography, or were some of these images newly introduced? And so how can we ensure that there was this sort of clear sense of visual literacy in these specific cases?
Well, with this image, there is a whole bunch of these, right, from across. I mean, this is the most famous one. It's the biggest. But there's a whole bunch of these, right? So I think there's a fairly standard iconography here. I think we can be fairly sure that this kind of research about how preachers responded to it and with it, and how it responds to preaching, means that there would have been, and that would have been done in the local language, etc. So there would have been some widespread instruction verbally as to what these images meant. Descriptions of artworks are, you know, precious to art historians from this period, and not as common as you would like. But it's curious that when Vasari comes to write about things like this, he has no trouble identifying them, whereas sometimes he just says flat out that he doesn't know what X is, and that's it's almost always classical art. He says things like that about. It's never, and that's because like the iconography for that hasn't been quite as well established. But this I think was a well-established visual mode, if you like. I've got, so this is another famous example. I only brought two, but there's another one in Florence that's quite famous, but it's also badly damaged. And so some of the details vary, right? This guy's on a horse, she's flying, but you know, the general principles are the same. These are huge, right? So this is a doorway. This is about doorway sized, right? So they would have been very big, right? And easily accessible. The general public, anyone, even the very, very, very poorest of people had access. In fact, the poorest of people were kind of encouraged to attend funerals, partly so that they could receive charity while they were there, but also because their prayers were felt to be efficacious, especially efficacious. So they were encouraged to attend, pray at the dead, and then they would get some charitable relief, some bread or new clothes or something. This is, anyway, items like these can be quite small, right? So the manuscripts, some of these drawings are actually pretty tiny. You guys can probably, this illumination on your screen is probably bigger than the original. You know, it might have been only a few, it might be only just a few centimeters big, right? You can see the measurements. I put the measurements in of these. But these objects would have been quite small, quite rarely, quite limited in their availability. And they provide I forget now why this was going to be relevant, but anyway, they provide a very unique access to the afterlife. So this is a story of the Petrarch writes approximately 1360s, called The Triumphs, in which he outlines a triumph of love, we translate it, but it's actually a triumph of cupidity, of sex, rather sexual love rather than caritas or whatever. But love, who's then, there's a triumph of charity, who defeats love, and death here in one version, or death in this one, defeats chastity. This is then followed by fame, and then by eternity. And this is a different schema to the one that's available to the public, right? The public get stories of risk and damnation on a very large scale to the whole community. The rich get an inevitable singular succession in one after another that only leads to eternity through death. This is the image, of course, from the poster. I can't remember why that was relevant.
So one of the things that I kind of, to kind of also think about literacy, I think that one of One of the things that I find when I'm teaching the Middle Ages now is that I feel like there's more of an understanding of some of the elements of medieval culture, the complete intertwining of word and image that was kind of lost, and then it's kind of being regained with a kind of contemporary focus on the image, right? So think of things like memes, like they work both as text and as image simultaneously. The internet is a medium of images as well as a medium of words, and those two things can't really be separated. And I think that when I'm thinking about the Middle Ages, and I think that this probably holds true, although Joseph can tell us, for this kind of early Renaissance period in Italy, that most people have a sense, because of their regular attendance of church, of the words of the Bible. And the words of the Bible are really directly illustrated in visual imagery. And that people actually have a very sophisticated ability to identify images. So think about the iconography of saints, for example. If you go into any kind of medieval art gallery now, any kind of medieval church, you'll see lots and lots and lots of people with halos, right, with nimbuses. And I can do a few of them. You know, St. Kathryn, she has her wheel with her. St. Agatha, she's holding her breasts on a plate. St. Lucy, she's holding her eyes on a stick sometimes, right? They're these kind of iconographical images of saints that key us in to the story of that saint. The word, the narrative, and the image are intertwined, they're inescapably linked. But a medieval person going into that same church would have been able to instantly identify every single one of those saints, right? They had a really high degree of visual literacy in relation to specific narratives, specific stories, and also in relation to particular Bible narratives. So if you look at, for example, the kind of Great Window in York Minster, you look at different images in the Great Window, you see, what's going on here? It's, you know, the moment that Christ throws the moneylenders out of the temple. And you would know that by looking. And you'd know the story because you attend church every week. And so every year you hear the whole Bible being read. Yeah. And so you have a kind of very high level of visual literacy and of kind of narrative literacy that kind of links those two things together. And I think probably that is the case also, Joseph, in the period that you're thinking about, right? There's a way in which we've lost this ability, partly because of the loss of a kind of shared religion. People who have a religious background will know these stories better and will be able to recognize these images better, Christian religious background, but also because of a kind of lack of imagery, right? They are medieval memes. I think this is, if this is one thing that I want you all to take away from from today's talk from me, it's that the iconography of saints is a medieval meme, right? We see it again and again and again, and it's changed slightly, but it's telling the same story and it's immediately recognizable. Yeah, sorry. I'm very excited about this.
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree. I mean, and what's distinctive, so while you're talking, of course, you're talking about the biblical narratives, like these ones, right? That would have been instantly recognizable. What's curious about these ones is that because they're in a poem, like only the fabulously rich had access to this poem, only the fabulously rich had access to this furniture, to this imagery. And so this imagery of inevitable succession through death to, you know, this is a one in Baltimore where the procession of death is paralleled very directly with the good death of the saint, even though it's Laura, she's not a saint. But in this version, the rich get to go to heaven and the rest of us get to go to hell.
That's so important, right? Is that we have a kind of huge amount of visual literacy, but also there's a kind of private visual literacy which isn't public. That's such a, I hadn't kind of really thought of that, but we have that in the English literary tradition too. So we'll see images of Chaucer in his little red hat, and there's images of him in lots of different manuscripts. And if you're literate, you'll see the image of the man in the little red hat and you'll be like, a picture of Chaucer. I know this is a Chaucerian story. But if you've never seen or heard any Chaucerian poetry and you see the man in the little red hat, you're not going to know who that is, right? And so I think that's really important, that there's a kind of, because of the way that text and image are intertwined, there's a kind kind of like language of imagery and language of text that you wouldn't necessarily be able to access. I know that we have a question from Fares in the chat. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask it?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, hello, Joseph. Hello, Kathryn. Yeah, my question is on the general approach, because it seems to me that really pictures are just illustration of some kind of knowledge that we can find. And let's say, if we bring a good anthropologist or historian of the rituals of death, he can give us, like, you know, from the medieval time till today, a quite accurate account of the different ways people conceived death or made their funerals or whatever. And it seems to me that the images here are just illustrations of that knowledge, meaning representations. It's as if images are just here to illustrate. Let's say in the medieval times, they used to not be afraid of death. So we have a picture of people not afraid of death. And then maybe later, death was confined to hospitals. So we have an image of death confined to hospitals. And of course, we can have we can detect into the images a lot of illustrations of these ideas, which is basically the approach by representation. Descartes used to think that nature itself represents our mathematical formulas and mind. So it has to be subjected to these formulas and mathematical models. But I think this is so the approach by representation is the dominant discourse, I think, as a form, because the whole domination consisted in reducing sensitivity and particularities to a discourse which is more or less universal and knowledgeable, and where the diversity of the different visual sensitive fields are just illustrations of that. And Descartes says that nature itself is just an illustration of his mathematics. So for me, the form here is like problematic. And second, I think that there are differences in the image. If you have the same theme, let's suppose this is a nice thing, or this is good for the novelty, or whatever the theme is. Now, then you have differences in the form. Like if you take a Renaissance treatment, the treatment itself in terms of space, in terms of light, in terms of depth, in terms of color, figure, etc., the treatment of the groups is quite different, let's say, from a medieval treatment, which can recount the same story. So I give you another example. If you take architecture, you have a villa. I can say, you know, Palladio is a villa, and Le Corbusier is a villa, and actually Frank Gehry is also a villa. So practically put, they're all just illustrating the thing, which their essence, which is to be a villa. I think here we really lose the differences in the creativity of and the formal problems of these objects, which are works of art. So this is why, for me, I feel a bit not at ease with this kind of transparency. It's as if the desires of society are immediately translated into images. Like the nobility didn't want to fear death, hence we have images of where no one is fearing death, or the nobility didn't like the poor, so we have images of the poor pictured in a bad way, which is for me quite problematic, because I think the form as such resists that. So for me, this is, if you want, a general critique to the approach by representation, because I really feel that the artistic dimension is just flown over. Yeah, so I wonder if you have the same theme, the same exact theme, death. How the formal components, how the formal treatment in terms of, again, space, color, light, ways of seeing, etc., how do these inform this common theme? Because, or else I think we really, or at least as far as I'm concerned, I just feel that I'm again under the domination of the logos, which dominates the images. And I don't see how we escaped. You see, I'm giving you a critique, a formal critique. I know that the intentions are good. I have no doubt about that, which is a kind of class critique, you know, the novelties, this is what they did. But I think maybe the critique has a form too. And the form that I see in what you're doing is a repetition of this model of representations that dominated thought for, you know, since Descartes and a bit before until today. So I don't know how you deal with that, or do you have, or does it talk to you what I'm saying, or you think it's just a bit unfair or out of propos, or?
I mean, I can. I mean, I can reply. We can talk about style and we can talk about iconography, but to some degree in the Renaissance, both of those things, and we can talk about materiality and technique, right? Yeah. So a lot of this changes, of course, once the printing press is invented, or with the move from egg tempera on panel to oil on canvas, right? This alters the dynamics here, right? But anyway, but part of the issue here, I think, in my field anyway, is that all of these issues, apart from the last one perhaps, anyway, but certainly iconography and technique and style, these have been very exhaustive, almost boringly covered. I mean, I'm not that interested in the iconography, partly because, I mean, the reason why this is a bull, for example, there's like 4 articles on that. I'm not sure that I can say any more about that, really. I mean, I don't know that there's anything further to add. That in fact, what's happened in the Renaissance studies is that they've used questions of style and iconography to distinguish it as special from other periods, and they've tried to use it to avoid tackling issues of like, well, why did they do these things and what effect did they have? And so instead they can spend years and years and years talking about iconography as if that is a legitimate, independent, natural, inevitable, inherently good thing, the way, like this, like the classicism of this could have been discussed by someone like Panofsky pretty, as far as I'm concerned, ad nauseum, but they never really asked why they did it, right? And so part of my work has been to establish the kind of use value of that classicism, and then to establish, well, they used classical motifs for these reasons, and they were classist reasons often. And I think that's a more useful form of scholarship than talking about iconography or technique or authorship, or any of these other things that have dominated Renaissance studies for decades, or style. I mean, I guess I just don't care about style. No.
Yeah, for you, the alternative is either iconography and technique, or the story, the political story, if I understand. So it's either just technique, like perspective, what color he used, or political, you know, the political worries that are supposed to pass in the image. But maybe there's something else. If you take the memes, you mentioned that the memes are like the medieval image and verb. So if you take Burroughs' analysis of the viral image, which is also related to the memes, he relates it to politics, Burroughs, and the electronic revolution. He relates it by showing that the meme actually functions as a virus, which is a short unit of image sounds that is supposed not to convey meaning, but to contaminate you. And this is part of a form of power and politics, which is the electronic form. Now, what I'm trying, So I'm trying to say it's not either, you know, just describing the Corinthian column and saying that, yes, this blue is that, but the shape of sight and the way space is being treated, I think it's in line with the politics, and I wouldn't go through the scene. Now, to put it simply, as an example, you can make a Hollywood movie about Marx, and the Hollywood movie structure is, in quote, sustaining and supporting capital and all of these things, even though the movie is on Marx. So, and here I'm not talking about then the iconography. So I think that the shape of the work, this is what I'm missing, because it's neither technique nor just politics. And this medium plane is, I think, what I'm trying to convey to you, which is the connection could be on the ways of seeing. Like Burroughs really thinks that today's visual feed functions on viruses. You know, the little beeps and sounds and all of these viral images that repeat meaninglessly, which is very different from the hermeneutics of the medieval times. The hermeneutics of the medieval time is a system of meanings that relate to each other. Everything has a system of signification to something else. Hence, you have a web of signification. So for me, when you isolate like image word, hence it's like a meme, for me, it's the same gesture of not going into the functioning of these systems of power, I think. So this for me is the critique. I'll let others, or unless you would like to reply. I don't know if you are understanding what I'm saying, but at least I'm expressing that.
Thank you, Faraz. I think we have another couple of questions,
yes.
so I'm going to go to them, but I'm sure you and Joseph will be able to talk about this at length.
Yes.
So David, I think you had a question for us.
I did. I think, I mean, the main thing I want to get across is just how fascinating and entertaining this has been. I could listen to you to talk about death all evening. This has been wonderful. A quick throwaway just on the question of collective consciousness of death that Kath, you raised earlier. It's nice to be so young we can't remember the Cold War. Because when I saw Joseph's title, it reminded me of the first section of Don DeLillo's novel Underworld, which is called The Triumph of Death, and is about, you know, probably read it. It's the event is J. Edgar Hoover simultaneously seeing a reproduction of the Peter Bruegel work of that title and learning that the Soviets have just successfully tested a nuclear weapon. No, I'm going to see if I can share my screen and ride my pale hobby horse into this conversation by taking us to the John Milton reading room. First, just to share what has been described as the gentlest death in English literature at the end of Milton's eulogy for Hobson, the university, the head of the university carriage system at Cambridge in the 17th century. If any ask for him, it shall be said, Hobson has supped and's newly gone to bed. And so this death as a sleep that Joseph began with before things got really dark, just reflected in that poem. And then, of course, Milton's famous death is the worst thing you could, it's almost impolite to bring this up in the context of art history, because the first thing he tells you is that you can't visualize it. When Satan encounters sin and death, the latter is the other shape, if shape it might be called that shape had none. And Milton's illustrators can't cope with this. They just revert straight back to a skeleton. And you know, thank goodness we have the detail of wearing a kingly crown, so that there's some like object fixity to include in this image. But I just wonder, just as a sort of provocation to either of you, really, if you see the iconographical tradition of death as a skeleton, is as fixed as it appears to be in the pictorial arts that I'm familiar with in the 17th century. I saw quite a bit of variation just in the examples that Joseph was sharing. A female death, clothed, fleshed, some others that were obviously not entirely skeletal. So I wonder if you can talk about any similarly eccentric or challenging representations of death in the art historical tradition.
So I think on one level, I would make a distinction between like when we use the word death, we often refer to we're either referring to like the event of dying or we're referring to the status of being dead. And we're referring to a personification that's often present or representative or somehow involved in those two things, right? And they're treated a little bit differently, right? So like my own experience, and maybe I should defer to Sarah here, who's on this call, I hope still.
Yes. So I also work on death, for those who don't know me. My sense is that the skeletal death is really a kind of late, it's established late. So in the 15th century, you see a lot more skeletal deaths. And then once you're into the 16th, 17th century, the skeleton is the thing. This is certainly true in the Northern European tradition. And as far as I am aware, also by and large, it seems to be true in the Italian tradition as well. In the earlier Middle Ages, you're much more likely to see decay of some kind. So corpses, things that are obviously objects that had been alive and now are not in some way. So bits of people, bones, but quite a lot of corpses in various states of decay. Sometimes animate and sometimes not. So you can have images of, in the position, like in these types of imagery of death, but obviously actually dead. So it's a corpse, it's clearly representing the idea of death, the concept of death, but it is itself dead. And then you also get the sort of undead dead, like the legend of the three living and the three dead, where they're quite lively and they're unsettling and they interact. Like this one. And that's so there's a whole lot of variation in the earlier section, and you also get male death and female death. So it's not gendered specifically, and you get loads of ungendered deaths where it's sort of difficult to tell. Often the female deaths are in contexts where she might be associated with gendered ideas like vanity, but not always. That's my 2 cents on that.
No, and I'm an early medievalist primarily, for those of you who don't know, and absolutely in the early medieval period, I think that what you said about the kind of decay is the thing, right? You'll see bodies with kind of almost, if we imagine the kind of zombie imagery, the kind of contemporary zombie imagery of kind of reanimated corpse rather than a skeleton. So we don't get that kind of, the imagery of the skeleton with the scythe, which is very common in the kind of 16th and 17th, particularly the 17th century. We get images more like, if you look at the kind of far left death here, he's kind of wrapped in his, in the clothes he was shrouded in, and they're kind of all kind of decaying off him. And this is a 14th century image, but this is even more the case kind of in the earlier period, that we get these kind of decaying forms. We have a couple more questions, so I think we could say more on that, but I don't want to, I know that we're already kind of running over a bit. So Liam, you had a question, and then Mooney, I saw you had a question in the chat, and then we'll have to wrap it up. So Liam, did you want to ask something?
Hi, can you guys hear me? Okay, great. So what I wanted to ask was, okay, I know we established that like the Renaissance and the medieval period are not exactly, there's no clean-cut line that separates them, and also it doesn't just happen over time, but over like geography. So could you guys maybe like give us some, let's say like different types of death, or death in different places at different times? I mean, understandings, but also like ways of representing it.
So
I'm feel like this also relates to Muni's question in the chat. So I wanted just to read it out so that we could kind of deal with both of them together. So she asks, I'm wondering when memento moris began to take on a more carpe diem aspect, is there a shift in thought or attitude towards death in later periods, 16th, 17th century? And she points out that it's a big theme in later metaphysical poetry, that you're going to die. Right, there's the kind of classic, it's Andrew Marvell, right? To his coy mistress, like, we're going to die, so we might as well have sex, is the vibe. Rather than this kind of earlier memento mori, which is like, we're going to die, and so you should probably not have sex, I guess. Maybe that's the big change. So yeah, kind of, I thought that was kind of related to Liam's question, that idea of the changes across time. So
yeah, I might share this image again, if that's okay, because I think, so this is perhaps an early example of where you've really got this kind of classical skeleton size, little wings, suggesting the flight of time. I think that memento mori stuff, the carpe diem, is kind of implicit in images like this, right? But you're right. I think that's a kind of 17th century, after post-Reformation kind of post-Tridentine tradition. I think in terms of, and I think it's precisely because that imagery works its way out of specifically devotional objects for private devotion, and they work their way, they find themselves in large-scale oil paintings and what have you for your sitting room or something, and there they've got a subtly different valence, right? It's not something you're doing in a pious moment alone, where you're contemplating your own death for your own soul's sake. Now it's a public expression of your general understanding and commitment, while at the same time showing off material goods, frankly, represented in the imagery, right? And it's got it's a recognition of the pleasure of objects that you are yourself, you've got in the rest of your house. It is itself an expensive vanity. The painting is, as well as an acknowledgement that it is a vanity. And that's kind of precisely why it's in that picture, if that makes any sense. It's almost an apology, an excuse for being middle class or upper middle class and rich, I think. And so that's precisely the kind of democratization of that imagery as it becomes cheaper and more widely available. The valence of it changes, if that makes sense. So by the end of the Renaissance, as well as the fact that the Reformation, etc., has dramatic effects on the kind of devotional lives in general. In terms of Liam's question, I think Philip Aries writes this fairly astonishing and widely read book called The Hour of Our Death, and he's got, I think, 3 big categories for the representation of death, or maybe there's 4, I can't remember. And he reckons that the medieval period is a period of the domestication of death. That's what he calls it. That all these rituals and all this material production is about trying to give a controlling and comforting sense of death for the whole community. And then, as kind of I mentioned earlier, which I borrowed directly from him, by the modern period, we've got this denial of death, essentially, that it's been medicalized and hidden, and it's no longer a thing that features in our kind of mental lives. And I think that's not quite true, frankly. I mean, I think he's right in many respects, but in fact, if I may call on Sarah again, she's got a better scheme where she's got these 3 co-equal aspects of death that appear simultaneously, and I probably appear in every period, just to greater or lesser extent. I mean, I don't know if you want to pick that up, Sarah.
Yeah, okay, so I suppose I would think of them as being kind of overlapping ideas about death. So there is the regular death, there's the death that happens daily, right? This is the experience of the funeral, the kind of community that is built around death, the household experience of death. There's an adjacent set of images which are about the decay of the body. So the regular death is about the absence, the body that leaves, right? The person is gone from your ability to daily interact with them. And the rituals are about dealing with that in some way. So they they offer specific actions that you take in those days and weeks after that absence. So your prescribed behaviors. There's an adjacent set of imagery, which is really about the death of the body, the bodily death, the decay, the aspects of death that are gross or problematic, right? So the body becomes a site of disease. Like you have to dispose of it. It's got to go. And so there's a set of imagery like the rotting corpse and the three living and the three dead that kind of navigate that anxiety about the physicality of death, that there is a shell, there is a leftover, this is a thing that has to be dealt with in some way. And then there's a third overlapping idea, which is about the redemptive nature of death within the Christian tradition. So the person is gone from the community, but only to enter another community. This is the community Joseph was talking about earlier of the dead, right, who are accessible in some way, but also that every Christian in the medieval and Renaissance period was in some way hoping for the redemptive death. That was the ultimate goal, was to be reunited with the divine in some way, to receive the beatific vision, right, to be once again whole, we might say, within that Christian worldview. So this is one schema, the regular repellent and redemptive deaths, as I would discuss them. But there are lots, I guess, of other ways of sort of distinguishing the different ideas that are held about death in this period. But for me, that's one that works pretty well and does seem to be present, at least from let's say the 12th through to the early 16th century, which is the area that I'm most familiar with.
Thank you, everybody, for such an engaging discussion. I feel like this conversation can probably go on for hours and hours, but perhaps I feel like we need to end now. But perhaps if people have more questions for Kathryn and Joseph, you can feel free to email them or reach out to them and share those questions with them. Thank you so much, Joseph and Kathryn, for pulling this together. I think it was an extremely engaging conversation, lots of food for thought. And thanks everyone who joined us this evening. And a special thank you to Sarah for contributing as well. It ended up being sort of a three-person conversation, which is really great, and which is what's so great about this sort of more informal type of series that we're hoping to run this semester. Bye everybody, and this particular recording will be available. I will be sharing it with probably on our Facebook page, a link to it on our Facebook page. We ultimately want to make these recordings available on a YouTube channel, but we haven't set that up yet. So those of you who want to go back and hear it again or tell your friends about it, it will be made public at some point in time. All right, good evening, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.